Ever since the trailer for Christopher Nolan's Odyssey came out, there have been a lot of strong reactions, to say the least. People are still arguing about the casting and what the armor is supposed to look like and all that. But this video is not about Nolan's film because at the heart of all of this seems to be this book. This is Emily Wilson's translation of the Odyssey, and it's rumored that this is the translation that Nolan used to adapt his film. And why should that matter? Well, because Wilson is being accused of rewriting Homer and changing the story, changing the characters, all in an effort to promote woke leftist propaganda. And by the way, some of you might think that all of this is kind of trivial, and maybe it is in some sense, but I think that the reason people are getting really worked up about this is because underneath all of this are deeper questions about cultural authority. You know, what kind of person are we supposed to admire? What is a hero supposed to be or look like? Or what counts as beautiful? And the ability to influence these answers, even a little, that's a very important form of influence. And when I see people arguing about this on the internet and on YouTube, both for and against, it seems like they're arguing as if there is a single version of the Odyssey that everyone already agreed on. But we need to be honest about this. For most of us, nothing that we understand about the Odyssey or the Iliad or any of those characters or just that whole world, none of that comes from a direct reading of the original Greek text, at least for most of us. Instead, it comes from translation. So that's why I want to focus on Wilson's book today. Not just the criticism against it, but also some of the things that people are saying in defense of it. So actually, I think that if you haven't read Homer's Odyssey in the original Greek text, actually, I think that's fine. You know, I haven't read the original Greek version either, but that doesn't mean that we can't have an intelligent or informed opinion about it. So one thing that we can do is consult some kind of independent, reputable source, such as scholarly reviews or criticism. People who have read the original and whose entire careers are built on thinking about and writing about these very questions. And so we can see, you know, how does that community respond to her work? So for this video, that's exactly what I did. And what I found is that the scholarship does not actually support the internet claim that Wilson is changing the story or producing a fake woke version of Homer. Having said that, though, it also doesn't support the simplistic defense that I've been hearing about Wilson's translation, which is that feminism or modern thinking does not factor into her translation, or especially this claim that Wilson's translation is the most faithful translation that's out there. Like most things, the reality is somewhere in between, and that reality is that Wilson is a real translator, and she is making legitimate, also sometimes controversial interpretive choices. So let's start here. Let's start with the claim that Wilson's translation is not progressive. So the argument goes that her feminism or her modern sensibilities or her modern thinking, these things do not factor into her translation. But this, to me, honestly, I don't understand why anyone would even want to make this argument, because, to be honest, I don't think that this is something that even Wilson would agree with. I found an article that she wrote for Oxford University Press called Translating Homer as a Woman. Wilson herself describes her Odyssey as a, quote, feminist project, and in it she lays out 7 different strategies for feminist translation practices. And as we're going to see in a second, Wilson's translation is very much influenced by issues surrounding gender, class, and power. These are all contemporary concerns. So clearly her translation is affected by modern thinking and her own stated feminist approach. Now, that doesn't mean that she invents plot events or she turns the Odyssey into a feminist retelling, but it does mean that her translation is influenced by modern sort of progressive priorities. And so what are some of those priorities? Well, for starters, Wilson objects to earlier translations that call the 12 enslaved women who had slept with the suitors while Odysseus was gone. She objects to calling them sluts or whores, partly because that language is not part of the Greek text, but also because it makes their deaths seem morally justified. In her version, she calls them girls, and the scene where they're killed feels more disturbing and almost brutal rather than as some kind of justified killing. And again, on the one hand, that may be more accurate than the so-called misogynistic older translations, but it is still a progressive intervention because it changes how the reader morally experiences the scene. And there are other places where you can see the same kind of treatment. In a scholarly review by Corinne Pache, I hope I'm saying that right, she compares Book 18 from 3 different translations, Fagles, Lombardo, and Wilson. So in this passage, Fagles uses the word maid, Lombardo uses housekeeper, and Wilson uses the word slave. And she writes that slave is the more honest translation than using maid or housekeeper. And by the way, why would Fagles or Lombardo not refer to them as slaves? Well, it might be because, remember, Odysseus is supposed to be a hero, and we're supposed to look up to him. And that's really difficult to do when we consider the fact that he had slaves. So calling them housemaids or servants is perhaps a useful way of maybe sweeping it under the rug. Now, Wilson is more faithful to the original text in some places, like we've just seen. That's true, but it would be a mistake to assume from these examples that this is her overall approach or this is her primary goal, to translate everything exactly the way Homer wrote it. Because in other places, her choices are, let's just say, they're very debatable. In a piece by Richard Whittaker, he points out that her use of slave in other places, for example, when Homer refers to the attendants, heralds, household officials, shepherds, nurses, and so on. Wilson translates all of those roles as slaves. And while some of those people are held as slaves, some are not. Some of those roles represent offices or jobs where the title itself, it doesn't really tell you if they're slaves or not. So, they could be, but not necessarily. Now, if you're wondering like me, why would Wilson make that sort of less precise choice? And I think the answer is that in doing so, it highlights or it emphasizes the power difference. And so that's a really interesting choice, I guess, when you think about it. But, Whittaker explains that that choice does come at a cost because, if we refer to all of those different roles as just slaves, then some of Homer's own distinctions kind of get lost. There are different roles, different ranks, different duties, and different degrees of dependence that make up Odysseus's household. And so it's just more difficult to see that when you refer to them all as just slaves. And this is a common criticism that Whittaker makes. He says, in places that Wilson's translation narrows a reader's interpretation more than it clarifies, meaning that she takes something that potentially has multiple different meanings, multiple different interpretations, as well as moral implications, and she translates it in a way that makes only one of those interpretations possible. Another example he gives is in the opening lines. Wilson says that he, Odysseus, failed to keep them safe, them meaning his own men. And that makes Odysseus sound more directly responsible for his men's deaths than the original Greek requires. Whittaker even goes so far as to say that in doing this, she is distorting and misrepresenting what the Greek text says. So this argument that Wilson's is a more faithful translation, that seems untenable because there are times when her translation choices unnecessarily force you into one interpretation, especially when it comes to issues surrounding gender, class, and power. But at the same time, you have to be careful here because he's not accusing Wilson of writing a fake Homer or replacing Homer with woke propaganda. That argument doesn't track either. Overall, translation is an interpretive process. You're not just replacing each Greek word one at a time for an English equivalent, especially with Homer. The language is ancient, the culture is ancient, and of course, every translator has to make these kinds of choices. What to cut, what to keep, what to highlight or maybe emphasize. And, we all have different things driving us and motivating us in our lives. We all have a point of view. We're human beings and we have our own sort of, moral convictions. So no translation is going to be a neutral treatment of the original. Overall, I think Wilson's book is certainly worth reading. I mean, I don't necessarily agree with all of the choices that she makes, and I definitely don't think that it's some kind of final or definitive translation. But I have to admit that it has forced me to notice things that I probably wouldn't have noticed otherwise. And to me, that's the whole point of reading.